In this video, we will discuss accessing some data in a JSON format and importing it into our Python program. JSON is an acronym for JavaScript Object Notation. We're not writing JavaScript, but we can still use this format because it is very popular across the internet. It's human readable because it's all in a text format. There is no binary data in a JSON file unless you really work at it. So one of the beautiful parts of JSON is it's interoperable across platforms. We can send it to a Mac, we can send it to a Windows machine, Unix machine, Linux machine, other kinds of applications running under those machines, and we'll always be able to read it because we have some idea what the format is, and we can be confident that the format is always in a text-based setting. In Python, a JSON file becomes a Python dictionary. To be more precise, usually it's a dictionary of dictionaries. And since we know that already, and we know how to use dictionaries, we can easily access the individual parts of the JSON data. We're going to make use of an API call. API is Application Programming Interface or Application Programmer's Interface, depending on where you look. The API is defined by the data provider, and we follow that API to request information from that data provider. There are many places to get free API support. The one that we will use is Datagov, and if you browse to api.data.gov, you can look up API resources for different parts of the federal government. For example, if you pick the Government Publishing Office, there doesn't appear to be anything there, which is fine. But if you click down, here's a whole list of API interfaces that you can use to request information. The API that we will use is on that home page, that link that I gave you, and that's the National Park Service. So I'm going to spend my time in the National Park Service API, and I encourage you to take a look at some of these others. They're not all documented exactly the same way, but they're interesting and they provide a lot of useful data. In order to use this API, the developer is required that you provide a key, which they call an API key. This is a popular strategy. In this case, the API key is free, and it is included in this second link that I've given you on this page. That's the key that I was given. It's free. We'll all use that key, or you are welcome to ask for your own key because they're free and it can't hurt to get the experience. Before we do that, let's just grab this first link on the page. And that's a link to the API documentation page. And that API documentation page gives you specific information relative to the National Park Service API. It tells you the things that you can ask for using that API. You can ask for something called an alert on a park. You can ask for information about different events going on in the park, about news releases in the park, or general information about that park. So grab the second one. In the second one, we're asking for alert information about a particular park. And remember, I learned to build this URL by reading the documentation about the APIs. So when you want to know more, when you want to know what other information you can get through this service, read the documentation and look at the different codes that are available. So this code says I want alerts, and I want alerts from a park that has code GRSM. So again, we're going to copy this, go back to our browser, paste it in, and there's the information available for park GRSM under the alerts category. And you can see there isn't very much. And as I studied this, I realized that they've kind of deprecated this, and they're referring you to Twitter to get more information about the Great Smoky Mountains. So while this is somewhat useful, the alerts API doesn't do much for you anymore. Now, if we use the arrows, we can collapse and expand information in that JSON data. And notice this is a formatted JSON string provided for you by your browser. So it comes to you as one continuous string of data, and the browser parses it because it knows it's JSON and gives you a more readable representation of that data. So one of your first tricks as a developer is going to be to build this URL by reading the documentation, by looking at examples, and then pasting that into a browser to make sure it works. Because that's a great debugging step. You don't have to write any Python. All you have to do is paste that into your browser, and if you don't get an error message, if your URL is properly formed and you're asking for the right information, then you'll get something back that you can read. On the next slide, we're going to use a different API. We're using the same key. The key is the same across all of these APIs that we're using, but we're asking for information about a park, whereas on the previous slide we asked for alerts about a park. This API is going to give us much more information, so it's a little more interesting. I'm going to copy this API, on this URL rather, and go back to my browser and paste that in. And you can see there that it blipped up a lot of gibberish for a moment and then immediately reformatted that gibberish into something more palatable for us because it realized it was a JSON file. So here we have two top level entries, one called total and one called data. Now the data entry collapses, and there are individual numbered elements inside the data element. In this case there's only one, but it's element number 0. Then inside that there's an element called contacts, and if I collapse all of these, you can see that the elements are all under the hierarchy of that data topic. And since it's JSON, I'd like to be able to navigate into any of these topics given that I know the names. I know there's something called contacts, something called states, something called longitude. I know that those exist because I can see them here on the web page. So I can write Python code to drill down into this JSON and extract any of this information very easily, actually. Let's write some code. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and start Eclipse and create a project. And in this project, you will need to import 2 libraries. If you don't have these libraries, be sure to use pip to install them before you start writing this code. You need a library called JSON and a library called requests. And I can paste those in, and they might need to be edited a little bit depending on the font that PowerPoint was using. So there's a couple of import libraries. and you immediately get a warning because you're not using them, but that's fine. We will use them in a moment. After you've imported those two libraries, on the next slide, I've given you a little tiny snippet of code that actually makes the request for the API. It receives the data back and then does a little bit of parsing on that data. I'm going to grab all of this code from the slide and paste it into my program. And I probably need to do a little editing. It looks like it's got some indenting here. Take out all those indents. Hopefully that pasted properly for you. If you have any syntax errors, you can clean them up. And then I click Run. And I get some output generated by this print statement right here. And if you look closely at the output of this program, you can see that it mirrors the JSON that we saw when we browsed to this URL from our web browser. So I use this same syntax that I gave you on the previous slide in a requests.get function call. It goes out to the web, finds the API server, puts in the request for some data, and receives that data back into a response object. And then the response object has a content property to let us grab the string, whatever was returned back by that response. And then we take that string and we call another function called loads, which is part of the JSON library. And that takes that string and puts it into a Python dictionary, and we're good to go because we know about dictionaries. So 3 lines of code lets me make a request to an API server, receive the information back from that request, and parse it into a Python dictionary. The hardest part, without question, is building that API URL, which I have done for you in this case. And if you look at the output again, you can see that there was under the data category, when we browsed to that API, we saw there were contacts. Under contacts, we saw there were phone numbers, and so on. We're seeing the same data, just in a slightly different format that we saw when we used that URL in our browser. Let's modify this URL just a little bit to get more information. So again, I'm going to grab this URL from the code because as a developer, it is easier to debug the URL in my browser window than it is in Python. Grab that URL, back to my browser, paste it in. Still works, good deal. And all the information that I got back was for this particular park code, ACAD. So the National Park Service has defined 4-letter codes for the parks, and you can find those on that API website as well, or you can Google them. And I happen to know that another park code is GRSM, whoops, probably lowercase, separated by a comma. Now I have 2 park codes in my API request. I'm asking for information about park code ACAD and information about park code GRSM. If I browse to that, I'm not having, oh, there it goes. I get more information now. If I collapse number 0, there's number 1, which is the second park. So now the data element in that JSON file consists of 2 dictionaries. The first dictionary is going to be information for the ACAD park code. The second element is going to be information for that GRSM code. This API then allows me to string arguments together, separated by commas, which is common. And then I can parse that to get information from two different parks. So let's go back to our code. And let's make the same edit we did before, comma, GRSM. Now we're asking for information about two parks. Let's run this. And we have it. The first park is the first line of output. The second park is the second line of output. And as long as we know that and we understand the format in advance, we can parse these JSON strings, these JSON objects, for whatever information we'd like to get out of them. To give you another example, let's assume that all I want is the description of the park. I don't want the entire blob of JSON data. I'm going to comment out that print loop at the bottom, and I'm going to uncomment the print statement in line 14. This is going to print a lot less information. It's going to drill down into the data, into the dictionary called data, into the 0th element in that dictionary, and then print the description that's found there. So I run this and I get the description for Acadia National Park. That is ACAD park code. But I only got one description. Didn't I ask for two? Hopefully you realize that I've got a 0 in line 15. I'm only asking for the first element in data. And I need to go ahead, if I want the other park description, and paste in another print statement and change that index from 0 to 1. Now I will get information from both parks when this runs. And you can see the strategy then. So study the structure of the JSON file using your browser, and then write code to index into that file using the names and the index numbers provided for you in your browser's rendition of that JSON file. It's an infinitely useful tool rather than trying to play guessing games trying to figure out where the data is. Let your browser parse the data for you, then use that information in your Python code to extract. All right, here's the URL that we just used a moment ago. Remember, I put in a request for two parks separated by a comma. You can see that highlighted there in yellow. This is something you can, as we've already done, copy and paste into your browser and experiment with. And on the final slide, I have provided a function that I wrote that iterates over an entire dictionary that's somewhat useful. You can, as we saw, just print out the entire dictionary if you like, but sometimes it's nicer to see it a little bit more organized rather than just a string. So let's grab that code. And let's go back to our program and let's paste that code right below the import statements. There we have a definition of a dictionary called, of a function rather, called iterate dictionary. It does print. When it finds a key value pair, it prints it out. So let's modify our code a little bit. I no longer need any of this print logic. All I'm going to do is pass my JSON that's been parsed into that. I'm sorry, parse JSON, my mistake. There we go. All I'm going to do is take that JSON dictionary that I made out of what the web API server sent me, and then I'm going to pass that to the function. Okay? No other printing. Every other print statement has been commented out. Let's comment out all of these. Doink. Doink. All right, everything's commented out except for the call to iterate dictionary. And then my iterate dictionary function will do all the printing. So this shows you all the keys and all the values and all the dictionaries that are embedded in that parsed JSON. This might be useful to you during debugging if you want to see everything that's been sent back to you from the API server. I'm not asking you to write this, but I just wanted you to see that there is a way, this is one way, to iterate over an entire dictionary and dump out everything that's in it in a little bit of an organized format. Let's have you make a change and a modification to this program that we've written. What I would like you to do print out all the email addresses. How do you get to the email addresses? Well, if you look at my syntax, you can see that I use parsed JSON and then a series of square brackets enclosing the names of those values. So I know that there's a description underneath the 0th element of the data value. And if you go back to your browser again and you expand the 0th element of data, you can see that under data there's something called contacts. And under contacts there's phone numbers and email addresses. That means it's data and then contacts and then email addresses. And then we can iterate through the email addresses one at a time using a for each loop. So follow my lead, study this syntax a little bit, and write a for each loop to extract email addresses. And I will wait for you. All right, hopefully you stopped the video and got this code to work. Here's my code. I use data, then I drill down to the 0th element of data, then I drill down into contacts, drill down into phone numbers, drill down into email addresses, which I know is a dictionary, so I can use the for construct to do that. Let's see how that works. I got an error. I also forgot to take out a print statement. Let me do that now. I forgot to, I'll just comment out this call to iterate. Okay, less mess. Anyway, the error is right there. The name data is not defined. Okay, so it doesn't know what data is. Well, didn't I just tell you there was something called data? If you look at my code, you'll notice that I did not put quotes around it. It is a named item. It is not a reserved word in Python. If I put the quotes around it, and actually around all of these, then it will properly drill down into the JSON to give me what I want. Let's try that. Still doesn't like it. List indices must be integers or slices, not strings. Do you see what I did wrong? Can you find a problem with this syntax to drill down into the JSON? I have data. I have the 0th element of data. I have the context element under that, the phone numbers element under that, and underneath that, the email addresses. Do you see the mistake that I made? If you flip back to the browser and you begin collapsing these things, you can see that the email addresses are underneath context. They are not under phone numbers. I don't need phone numbers in that logic. Let's go back and see if that fixes it. Let's take out completely phone numbers. And this is commented. Let's run it now. There we go. We drill down through data, through the 0th element of the data, into contacts, and into email addresses. Now if I want the email addresses for the second park, remember I asked for information about 2 parks, I can duplicate that logic and sneak a 1 in there. Now I get email addresses for the first park, Acadia, and the second park, Great Smoky Mountains. It's a little bit clunky though, because I had to write 2 loops. I hard-coded that 0 and that 1. So it's not quite what I want. If I added a third park, I wouldn't get the information printed out for that third park. So I would ask you to go ahead modify the logic to handle any number of parks. Say right now, we assume 2 parks, which is not a good thing because there might only be 1 in some cases. The user might want 3 in some cases. So how can I modify this? How can I get this into one loop that works for any number of parks? And I will give you some time to work on that. Okay, I ask you to modify the logic a little bit. Are you ready to see my code? There's my code. I have a loop in line 35 that steps through all of the parks, which is actually data sub 0, data sub 1, data sub 2. And we know in this case there are 2 parks. And then inside of each park, I know there are 0 or more email addresses. So I use another for loop. And inside that for loop, I drill down into the email addresses section and then step through each one of those individually and do a print statement on those individual email address elements. To demonstrate this, you can see at the bottom I've already run mine. Let's comment this out. And the only thing that's going to print now is that second set of logic that I wrote to handle an unknown number of parks. So let's run that. And there is 1 email address from each of the parks. You can verify that that is correct by returning to your browser. Then you can see that under email addresses for the first park, there is only 1. And if I collapse the first park, I can scroll down into the second park and there was 1 email address in the second park as well. So that seems to work. The next thing I would like you to do, and let's open up some space here and let's say modify this program to handle, let's say modify this email logic to handle any number of email addresses and any number of parks. All right, and I'm just referring to what I gave you here. What do you have to do to that logic to work with 3 parks or 6 parks or 10 parks in the data request, and then any number of email addresses in each one of those parks? Go ahead and work on that now, please. I'm back, and I wonder if you were able to make this change for me, modify that email printing logic to deal with any number of parks and any number of email addresses. And I hope you're not mad at me, but it was a trick question because this logic already does that. And I wanted you to recognize that by using these for loops correctly, we can step through any number of elements in a dictionary. I don't care how many parks there are, because line 35 will process every park one at a time. I don't care how many email addresses there are in a park, because in line 36, it will process all the email addresses in the current park that is being processed. We can do a simple test of this by adding another park code to the data request. I added LAKE, which is a national park, separated by a comma. So all 3 of the park codes are now in the data request. That's all I changed. I didn't change any code. I just added this park code to the data request. And let's see what we get. And there it is. There's our 3rd email address for that 3rd park that we added to the data request. And that seems to work. Okay, I encourage you to work with this sample program that we've developed. Try different things. Go back and look at the API calls for the different government services that are available. And if you have any questions, post them. Otherwise, feel free to get on with your homework. Thank you.